Welcome to Sparks of History. Professor Edward Berenson, author of The Accusation, Blood Libel in an American Town, joins us today. Professor Berenson, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
As we all know, just a few days ago, 300,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. in support of Israel and against the alarming rise of anti-Semitism in America. From your perspective, Professor, sitting in New York City at an American university, what's your take regarding the current state of anti-Semitism in the USA? What can we learn from if anything, from the Massena, New York blood libel of 1928? Why particularly demonstrations, which seem to be very heated on college campuses? What can be done? What needs to be done?
Boy, these are complicated questions.
Yes.
And there is clearly a rise of an increase in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses and elsewhere in the United States. Fortunately, at my university, NYU, New York University, it hasn't been too bad, but really close by at Columbia, and even closer at Cooper Union, which is right around the corner from NYU. At Cooper Union, there was a terrible incident where some Jewish students were really being threatened physically by a group of pro-Palestinian students, and the Jewish students were locked into a library so that they wouldn't have to face this really angry mob of students. And the police were not really protecting the Jewish students as well as they should have. And the only protection was to keep them inside a building, whereas it certainly seemed like the police officer should have allowed the Jewish students to go about their normal business, their normal activity, and instead they had to take refuge. And there have been a few incidents like this around, and it's alarming. I want to add, though, that it seems like these incidents are somewhat isolated. They get played up in the media, and which is not to downplay how alarming they are. Any incident of anti-Jewish hatred is a terrible thing, but it doesn't seem like any majority or huge number of American campuses are seeing these kinds of things. And for reasons that I don't quite understand, they're more likely to happen at more elite universities than at state universities and just sort of normal average places around the country. And so I guess that's somewhat reassuring. And you asked me if there is anything about the story I told in my book, The Accusation, which was about the only really known case of a blood libel against Jews in American history. If there's are there any lessons to be learned from that? And I guess if there are lessons, it's that anti-Semitism can and has surfaced in the United States, but in general, the outcome has been positive because in general, authorities are opposed to acts of hatred and violence against Jews, and so that the state and governments in general do nothing to fan the flames of that hatred, and on the whole instead try to oppose it. And so that's what makes for Jews in America still, even today, it makes for a safer situation than we've seen historically, especially in Europe or nowadays in Middle Eastern country. And that is authorities in general are hostile to this sort of anti-Semitism and usually do things to prevent it from spreading.
I recall in the previous interview when we discussed the Massena, the accusation of blood libel, you had analyzed that there were a number of factors that went into that, whether it was Henry Ford, the KKK,
Right.
immigrants, and some other issues. Do you feel like there's a collection of reasons for the rise of anti-Semitism? Is it simply linked to Israel? Is it just, or is that just Israel just the excuse for the rise?
I think social media is a huge problem. Social media is a huge problem. And so immediately you have the ability to transmit hatred and falsehoods about Jews and about Israel, and suddenly you can transmit these things to millions of people with the tap of a keyboard. And so this is what makes things different from the 1920s and more alarming. In the 1920s, you had Henry Ford's newspaper, which was just an awful rag of anti-Jewish hatred. But its circulation, it was large, and many hundreds of thousands of people read this newspaper, but not like today. You know, that Henry Ford newspaper came out once a week. It had a circulation, but it was still limited. Whereas now you've got all these places where people can go, or feeds that they just get automatically in their on their phones that transmit all this stuff. And so I think what's going on in Israel and in Gaza now is a trigger for a set of feelings and ideas that are there in the culture and ready to be amplified in social media. I think and what we see is that there's a real divide generationally in this country, whereas younger people are less likely than older people to be sympathetic to Israel, to understand the dangers that it faces. And the younger people are less likely to know anything about the history that has created this situation. And so there's just a lot of really false and damaging analogies that circulate among younger people. And one of the worst is that Israel is an illegitimate colonialist society. You know, younger people have learned that colonialism is bad. And, you know, there's a lot of really good evidence that colonialism has been a bad thing, but they don't understand that Israel does not fit into that pattern. And so you've got people who are in their late teens or their early 20s, and all they know is a recent history of violence in the West Bank. And there are plenty of reasons to dislike the Israeli policies in the West Bank, but then they amplify that and they apply it to the whole situation. And so in extreme cases, and there are all too many of them, that applying a kind of opposition to what's going on or what has been going on in the West Bank to the entire situation of Israel, and then using these ideas to apologize for the atrocities that Hamas has committed. And somehow this becomes, in the minds of certain people, legitimate resistance. And that's the really, really worrisome thing that happens, is the apology for atrocity on grounds that somehow Israel is responsible for it, and in even extreme cases deserves it. And so I think this is a failure to some extent of the educational system in the United States, which is not able to present a real history that people could be exposed to. And I think that's one reason why there's such a generational difference, that people who are in their 40s and 50s and older have lived through this whole experience and understand, in most cases, the dangers that Israel faces and the really difficult problems it has to confront. And younger people just they haven't lived through that history, and they haven't learned it in school. And so this lack of really correct understanding of history leads then to a set of ideas in the present that really can be terrible, and when taken further than they should be, can lead to hatred of Jews. And Jews, if Israel is the oppressor and Jews support Israel, therefore American Jews are oppressors too. And that's how you get to attacks against Jewish students and the kind of hateful discourse that you see in certain social media places.
What should some of these university administrators, presidents, leaders be doing that they might not be doing? You know, it's always the battle cry of free speech. University is a place of exchange of ideas. That's why they're there. We're molding the students to think. What you're saying really is they're really not thinking because they haven't received enough of an education to really balance two sides. Is this a failing on the university level as well in their response today?
Yeah, on a number of different levels. So it's a failure of the educational system in general. And so in schools, in high schools, American students don't learn much history, and the history they learn is awfully simple, and it could be one-sided. And that extends to universities. Universities do a better job, certainly, with history than schools do. But the problem is that most students go through universities without learning any history at all. You know, when early in my career, I started out at UCLA in California, and every undergraduate had to take some history. And that's no longer the case. And so we're raising a generation of students who are ignorant of history. Now, when it comes to university administrators, there's nobody more timid than university administrators. And so they're trying to be uncontroversial. And so that has led to a neutrality, which under these circumstances has caused problems. And so they're afraid to take a stand against anti-Jewish hatred and anti-Jewish demonstrations. And they have now paid a price for that. So they've been critical. And so they're now beginning to do the kinds of things and take the kinds of actions that they should have done right from the beginning. And you have to see this in a context in which university administrations have in recent years taken stands on current issues. And so they pretty commonly took stands on, say, matters of involving race and on Black Lives Matter. And I think that was a mistake. I don't think that universities as institutions should be taking overt political stances on contemporary issues. What they should be doing is facilitating education about those incidents and activities. They should be facilitating civilized debates, the exchange of ideas. They should allow for different perspectives in a context that keeps those exchanges about ideas, and that doesn't allow them to erupt into violence or into menacing situations. And that's where university administrators have failed. They've taken stances as institutions, which is inappropriate. That has then led nowadays to calls for the university to take stances on what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And that's not what universities should be doing. They shouldn't be intervening in the political realm. What they should be doing is facilitating intellectual discourse about current events, and an intellectual discourse that brings in the history, that brings in the complexity, and that allows for different points of views to be aired in a context of civil exchange.
In conclusion, are you optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in between as to where things are going, specifically regarding anti-Semitism and American Jewry?
So I'm more pessimistic than I was before October 7th. And I'm afraid that attitudes among younger people have been hardened in a way that is problematic and maybe even dangerous. And so I worry that as long as the war continues, the danger for American Jews rises. I think that still American Jews are in a relatively safe place in this country, but it's a place that's become less safe in recent weeks, and that does worry me, and it makes me more pessimistic than I was.
Okay. Again, we're just trying to get a little taste of your perspective, which we appreciate very much, and hopefully things will get better. That's our hope and prayer all across the board.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the things in Israel, I can't imagine. It's been a few years since I've been in Israel, but I can't imagine how difficult, how worrisome, how dangerous the situation is there. And so my heart goes out to everything that
it is frightening. But on the other hand, it's a different country than it was 40 days ago. There is a unity. There are the stories that are coming out in terms of sectors of society that are just coming together and building bridges, and the realization that things afterwards just need to be different and can be different. But we just have to get through this most difficult period now. So again,
yeah. Well, I mean that's the silver lining in this really terrible situation. And that's actually something that I hope that Americans can learn from, that the unity that we see in Israel, because the divisiveness that existed before October 7th was dangerous. And we have that kind of divisiveness in our country, and I don't see any immediate solutions to it. And that's really what's dangerous for the long term, is when a society is so divided against itself, when you see your fellows as enemies and not as people who share values with you. That's when things become dangerous. And I think it's heartening that Israel has come together, and I hope that we Americans, I don't want us to have to experience the horror that you experienced to have triggered that, but I hope we can learn the dangers of really extreme divisiveness.
Again, thank you so much, Professor Berenson. Appreciate it very much.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Okay.